Welcome to the Heart Path Podcast. I'm your host, Yvonne Ellis. The Heart Path Podcast spotlights authors, changemakers, nature lovers, and creators of all kinds. Each of our podcasts aim to share interviews and stories of beauty, resilience, and inspiration for all. This week's guest is Amy Irvine. Amy is the author of Trespass, Living at the Edge of the Promised Land, and Desert Cabal, A New Season in the Wilderness. Her essays have appeared in Best American Science and Nature Writing and Best American Food Writing series, as well as Orion, Tri-Quarterly, Pacific Standard, High Country News, Outside, and Climbing. Amy lives and writes in Southwest Colorado. Her second memoir, Almost Animal, is forthcoming from Spiegel and Grau. You can follow her and her work at amyirvine.com. Hello, Amy. Thank you so much for joining me on the Heart Path podcast. It's wonderful to have you here. And I would love to hear about your new book, Almost Animal.
It is a memoir that picks up where my first memoir, Trespass, Living at the Edge of the Promised Land, left off, which was with a new baby and a marriage hanging in the balance and a lot of uncertainty about the importance of wilderness, and my ideas about that have evolved quite a bit. And I think that shows in Almost Animal. For one thing, we're realizing that they're threatened. They're not just a given, but also that they are ancestral lands, that the indigenous people who were here before really have every right to be speaking for them and managing them, co-managing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so this book picks up with the new baby and the undiagnosed postpartum depression and even psychosis that I had, and a move from Utah to Southwest Colorado, not far from the Utah border, becoming a new mother in a precarious state. I also had a child who immediately had health issues and continued to have them till ultimately at 9 years of age. My kid was diagnosed with nocturnal epilepsy and a pretty severe version of it, like 20 or 30 seizures a night. And so the journey of trying to find out what's wrong with my child, and myself being out of balance, and the earth being out of balance, and the West being at a crossroads of cultures and values and stories. Through all that, realizing that I had this generational legacy from my original and very illustrious Mormon roots. I had written a lot about and thought a lot about the men. They're much easier to read about because they all are mentioned in history and they're celebrated, and all their accomplishments and even their dark deeds get romanticized and mythologized. And I had fallen into the trap of doing that same thing, which, as a Mormon girl, 6 generations later, it was easy to fall in that trap. I'm pretty conditioned for a patriarchal viewpoint. So in this book, as I'm in labor, looking out at the Salt Lake Valley, a very long and difficult labor, I realized, oh my God, what did the women go through? I hadn't given that much thought until I was about to become a mother too. So the journey is with this child, and through a marriage that was sort of based on these traditional gender roles, how I found my way back to myself, which has to do with a lot of animals that showed up almost magically, miraculously, strong medicine, as some people would say, to help both my child and me. And I really place a lot of hope in our collective future on those animals. Not that they're here to serve us in any sort of way, but they're here in the communal spirit and have a lot to teach us if we start paying attention. So it's a long journey toward ending a whole way of life and an ending of a legacy that I think is one of the reasons that I was so unwell and my child was so unwell. We were really carrying a legacy burden of women who were all plural wives, who lived alone in harsh environments with very, very little. All of them were pretty neglected, particularly one grandmother that I know of. So how we inherit that kind of scarcity or deference to a head male of household that's actually not even there, how that perpetuated generations of abuse and environmental destruction in my own family. Then ultimately, that led to also understanding that generational trauma isn't just inherited by the oppressed, specifically on this continent. That would be all the indigenous people and the Africans and African Americans who were enslaved, and how all of our wealth and all of our property and all of that was built on those two huge crimes. And we're pretty defensive about that. But the defensiveness of it, I think, speaks to how much it's alive in our body, like a hot wire that if we touch it, it just zaps us. And so I was really bumbling about trying to understand how, the more I learned about some of the dark deeds that my family was involved in, or atrocities they were at least adjacent to, how that might still live in me, and how much that helped me heal and helped me heal my kid. And if we look at it from the perspective of many, many other cultures, certainly not the one I was raised in, but cultures who believe that anything you heal in yourself in this moment heals the past and the future. And I don't know how that works, but I do know that finally getting that story out on the page, which cost me dearly, like almost everything, actually helped me gain everything, because there was a lot of healing, like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders.
Can we go into that a little bit about what you've lost and gained through this process of writing this book?
Yeah. So we know more and more about the nervous system of people who carry trauma epigenetically. I don't know if you've ever heard of the cherry blossom and the mice. There's one particular study that I'm quite fond of, in which they discovered that mice love the smell of cherry blossoms the way humans do. And if they hook up their little brains and have them smell blossoms, their pleasure centers light up like ours do. They just love the smell. These scientists introduced a harsh shock to one of their feet every time they smelled one. And these mice developed PTSD symptoms, as we would, were we to be repeatedly stressed in that sort of way to some sort of negative stimulus. They took the mice away. The mice had babies. They brought the babies without the parents back to this cage with the cherry blossoms. And the minute they smelled it, they had PTSD symptoms.
Wow.
And they've seen the same thing in descendants from Holocaust survivors that didn't know about their parents, their forebears being sent to, say, Auschwitz on a cattle car, but would see the train go by and have this panic attack of sorts, or some sort of intense response that they didn't understand. So we know there's something epigenetic. Certain stimulus gets introduced, some genetic switch gets flipped, and suddenly we're, experiencing something that we didn't experience in this lifetime. So between the epigenetics and a lot of adverse childhood experiences, I certainly count as, and have been diagnosed as, with complex PTSD, meaning chronic developmental trauma. I was really hardwired and set up to self-destruct and take everything down around me. So I chose relationships that weren't good for me. And I made a lot of mistakes as a mother from conception on. So all this is building to a head as I'm trying to write this book. And I went to a friend's little studio to finish it up when my most recent husband, and we can get to what I mean by that, said, I'm selling the house and leaving. And so suddenly I was without a house, without my marriage, my child, who had been very dependent on me and thankfully had survived long enough and healed enough to go off and go to college and be independent and not needing me anymore. But it was also a loss. I was very disoriented to have been such an extreme caregiver for so many years, and then suddenly have that taken away, as much as I celebrate it. And I had long COVID. And so it was a lot. Most people don't do well with long-term chronic illness and people who are constantly in chaos. I get that. But it means I lost a lot of friendships, burned a lot of bridges, dropped a lot of balls. And this book is the way out of that. I actually couldn't write this book until I lost all of that. What's the saying? Having burned to the ground, I can now see the moon. It was like suddenly I could see my life in a different way. And certainly see where the patterns came from. And, when there's nothing left to lose, you have to let go of all that's not working or something terrible happens. So I was very fortunate in that I was surrounded by a lot of really, really good healthcare providers, really wonderful friends and community. And it all came together, but it was kind of by the skin of my teeth. I mean, I was camping out at a friend's for 2 years, living off the last of my savings. Like, it took everything to finish this book. But in losing everything, it just became so clear what matters and how this whole culture, I am not alone. Like, we are all profoundly traumatized by what we carry, the stories we carry in our body, and the harm that has been done by our ancestors or by a communal kind of ancestry, and how we perpetuate that by ignoring it or denying it or justifying it or all the things that we do. And so when I teach writing, and in particular memoir, I ask people about their ancestry and where their ancestors came from, who lived on the land that became theirs before then, what happened to those people. Almost across the board, no matter how much people believe that racism and slavery are wrong and that we need to do some repair over that, they're very defensive about their own context that's shaped their world or whatever wealth is. And it takes people, it can take them 6 months before they'll really get curious about it. There's something very hardwired in us, that survival brain is like, no, we're not going there, because that is a whole mountain full of trouble to reckon with. And so plowing my way through that was really painful and uncomfortable.
I bet.
I think it's also what made me very sick and why I didn't get over COVID. But once I started to heal and I could actually form complete sentences, which was part of the trouble with COVID, long COVID, is that terrible brain fog and all the cognitive decline that we now see actually in brain imaging. I had it pretty severely. And when I finally got treated, I was able to really turn my life around, and I was able to really finally put the book together.
Thank goodness. Oh, I'm so grateful for that. And thank you for unearthing this history of ours and where we've come from, and for inspiring others to do so themselves, because in order for us to heal and move forward, I think that is a very important process in our lives that we should go through. And we don't have to, but I do think that it is a healthy way of being. So thank you for sharing that. Did you by chance bring an excerpt from Almost Animal?
I do. Yeah, I do.
I would love to hear it if you'd like to share it.
Sure. So this is from the prologue that sets the scene, and it also helps people orient for those that have read Trespass, where this is in relationship to that memoir. I chose to give birth in Salt Lake City, my hometown, in the same hospital where I'd been born, a hospital built and owned by the Mormon Church. I planned to do things naturally, to let my body take its course. Unlike my mother, who in 1966 arrived to the same hospital, less to labor than to have me expelled with maximum ease and minimum mess. She wasted no time walking. She put on a gown and went straight to a row of reclined, well-groomed ladies, mostly fair-skinned and blue-eyed, mostly Mormon, and mostly eager to have lots of kids. She climbed onto her bed, though, slid between the sheets and said, "Let's get this show on the road." When my own due date drew near, an unfamiliar terror bloomed. I pressed my mother for details about my birth, thinking they might soothe. She said she'd hated the maternity ward, and that my father was too cheap to pay for a private room. Say more, I said. Not about the money, but the physical facts of having me. Her face went blank as stone. She shrugged and said, "I recall nothing." When I raised an eyebrow, she offered one thing more. I told the doctor I couldn't deal with the pain, nor could I bear seeing my own bodily fluids. So he shot me up with the most amazing drugs for both anesthesia and amnesia. She smiled at being spirited away into what was peddled to new mothers as twilight sleep, though for many takers, there was nothing restful or dreamy about it. The meds tipped some women into such a wild state that their obstetricians strapped them down for their own good. Nurses say that these patients thrashed hard enough that the restraints cut into their wrists and ankles. Some mothers, when they came to, struggled to connect with their newborns. I stared at my mother, who'd been raised on a ranch in southern Idaho's outback. She'd seen countless animals exit the birth canal. Her aversion to this process made zero sense. That's when she added, "When I woke, there was a baby in my arms. I had no idea where it had come from or why I'd been entrusted with its care." Those words, I should have known, were harbingers of what lay ahead in terms of my own maternity. I would try to do better by my child, and in hindsight, my efforts perhaps made things worse. What I did know then was this: I could not close the distance or heal the disconnect between me and the woman in whom I gestated. My water had broken the day before, 1 month too soon, on a white designer couch that belonged to some friends. I just returned from a walk along the faint shoreline of an ancient lake that during the last ice age lapped at the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains, which stand like ramparts on the eastern edge of Salt Lake City. At one time, Lake Bonneville filled the whole valley. It also covered much of northern Utah, southern Idaho, and eastern Nevada. I've hiked every section of the 100-mile-long Bonneville Shoreline Trail, but on the day my water broke, I trundled along the portion that skirts the University of Utah, my alma mater. I was heading toward the mouth of Emigration Canyon, through which tens of thousands of Mormons, my ancestors included, entered the valley in the mid to late 19th century. It was there, quite near the spot where church leader Brigham Young said famously that this valley was the right place, that I grew breathless. My pulse pounded in my throat and behind my eyes. Only then did I realize I'd gone too far, that getting back to the car might prove impossible. Hands on knees, I panted and waited for things to settle down. In the meantime, I looked out at the valley where the city unfurled in every direction and tentacled the land. How much my hometown had grown in the 4 years since my father's suicide, when I packed up and headed south to Utah's Red Rock country. And the air, so polluted now. Everything hued in sepia, like a photo taken long ago. I tried to imagine Lake Bonneville beneath the city's overlay. This wasn't hard, since its remnant, the Great Salt Lake, still shines plainly near downtown. And maybe it was the sweat that brined my eyes, coupled with the thrash of sky-high blood pressure, that caused a vision to materialize, the scrim of tar, brick, and steel peeling away from the land to reveal a substrate of gray-green hardpan. Scattered across the parched lake bed's expanse were countless bones, as if it contained every kind of animal that ever lived here, from the earliest marine life to extinct dinosaurs to exiled wolves and bison. Some bones were fossilized. Some were bleached and porous, drained of minerals and marrow. Others were denser, newer. From the most recent, strings of sinew still dangled. I wiped my eyes and looked again, though I wish I hadn't. The vision persisted. Among the bones were human skulls, scattered for miles like dice thrown across a felted table. Empty eye sockets gawked at the soiled sky. Lipless teeth grinned garishly at the ground. My blood turned cold, reptilian. I turned and trundled back to the car as fast as I could. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close behind. But every time I turned to look, there was only the slight shiver of brush, a bit of kicked up dust. I ran through the possibilities: cougar, coyote, serial killer. Over the years, I'd been stalked by both animals and men. This was neither. It would take years, 2 decades to be exact, to understand that what trailed me was more akin to a ghost herd or shadow pack. Who knew the past could creep up like that, en masse, like some haunted, hungry horde? My body's response was vivid and visceral. It knew. If I couldn't stay out in front of this thing, whatever it was, I'd either be trampled or consumed. An hour later, back in the city, I collapsed onto my friend's white couch and pressed a tall, cold glass of water to my forehead. I never took a sip. Right then, a geyser burst between my legs, nearly 4 weeks ahead of schedule. My first thought, bring it on. My second thought, run.
Woo! Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Amy. Oh, I've always loved your words and the way that you form them and create these images that we can see and feel. Woo! Holy moly, so powerful. Wow. Who is publishing Almost Animal and when is it going to be out?
Spiegel and Grau are publishing. They used to be under one of the big behemoths. I can't remember who, but back then they published some really bold visionary titles like The Kite Runner and Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. So I was really excited when the big behemoth, whether it was Simon and Schuster or Random, I can't remember, but they wanted to get rid of the imprint, Spiegel and Grau, but keep Spiegel and Grau, the editors. And both women said, no, we're out of here. And with a ton of backing, started an indie publisher that is going up against all the big guns and doing quite well with its titles. They are very focused on place-based writing, which is really exciting to see. So we're seeing a lot more Western titles coming out of New York, finally. And they just published Go as a River, Shelley Reed's debut novel about the Paonia Blue Mesa Reservoir area in Southwest Colorado and what happened to all kinds of settlers in their orchards and these new homesteads that they claimed from the people who lived there before when the reservoir came in and filled up. It's a beautiful novel. And that's done quite well. I think it's been translated into 27 languages, and Shelley just signed for a major motion picture. So Spiegel and Grau are really doing something special. Joey McGarvey has been working with me as an editor. She comes from Milkweed and has been amazing. There were times I turned in just pages of gobbledygook because I just didn't have the language for it. It felt to me like really, truly breaking free of a cult. And I don't just mean Mormonism. I feel like just a whole world view that still was shaped by patriarchy in ways I didn't understand. And I think that's where I'm grateful my last marriage ending was that it made me realize that the book was largely about my relationship to marriage and this deeply ingrained Mormon must be married. You can't get into heaven unless your husband's there to pull you through the veil. Only your husband and God know your password. And even though I was infuriated at a very young age that girls didn't get to pass the sacrament or give blessings or all that, I mean, it was clear to me boys were much favored over girls. I still didn't understand until I wrote this book how much that had continued to shape me and how I was sort of compulsively getting married and seeking this long-term partnership because of that conditioning, even though I was bucking against it from the minute I said I do, I was fighting it. And so, of course, I had a string of failed marriages. And that's one of the things I talked to Edward Abbey about in my previous book, Desert Cabal. He was known as having multiple wives and lots of kids and lots of lovers, and kind of got away with it, kind of got celebrated for it. So I didn't think I could take him to task unless I came clean about my own relationship history. It's something he and I share, but I think for very different reasons, right? So it very much felt like coming out of a cult, this deep deconditioning that required lots of therapy and lots of reckoning. And yeah, I think I'm safely on the other side of it.
Yeah. And what I love about it too is that you are so honest about this process. And I think that your honesty is actually very inspiring to our listeners because so many of us have been programmed to think certain things or value ourselves in certain ways based on the ways that we were raised and the ways that people have treated us throughout time. And so all of us have stories like yours where we've gone through the process of learning what we should and shouldn't do. And some of us have realized that that's not going to work, that conditioning is not going to work for us, and that we need to go our own way and follow our own path. And so I love what you're doing and how you're doing that and how you're giving to this world through your words to inspire others to break free themselves and to have compassion with themselves through the process of dismantling and creating anew. So
radical self-compassion is crucial to the process. And it's the only way we're ever going to confront the institutions that we've benefited from as European descendants in this country. So many of my fellow writers and poets and activists and artists and teachers of color, Indigenous and people of color, are just like, you guys got to help us with this generational trauma work. You've got to help us. As long as you guys keep framing your stories just in these pretty little bubbles and not reckoning with the larger, how did we get here?
mm-hmm.
The nation's going to be in trouble. I think that's very much at the heart of where we're at now with these deep divisions and people behaving so incredibly badly and not taking care of each other.
Mm-hmm.
That requires not only tremendous radical self-compassion and self-care, because that's the only way you can care about anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
It also requires, and this is very much a muscle that needs to be built, but a kind of vulnerability, right? We've been trained to just be tough.
Yeah, to be perfect, to perform, to show everybody what they want to see. And so many of us have this beauty within that we hide because we're trying to be something that people expect us to be. And I love the beauty that you're showing right now. I love what you're doing right now to move forward. Do you have advice for listeners of how they can use writing or storytelling to move through transitions in their lives and transform their past to create a new present?
Yeah, first of all, I think the stories we tell ourselves can go one way or another. The negativity bias in our brains, which is an evolutionary trait, has saved us from serious danger, especially when we were running from saber-toothed tigers and dire wolves. But even now, that negativity bias can be useful in a dangerous situation. But for the most part, it gets in the way of seeing what's possible. Even in a trauma story, whether it's climate change or missing and murdered Indigenous women, or in my case, this failed marriage, this very sick kid, my own just complete falling apart. It's a pretty sad story unless I go in and I just really look around for what else is here, what else is possible. Is there a moment where I felt something new? Is there a moment where I saw myself in a new way? I saw the possibility of what I could be. And because we all have gotten out of those situations to be here to write the story or tell the story, I feel like there's a way that the story gets ossified. This is what happened. It was terrible and it's very brittle. And I think of it as like a dystopian, apocalyptic zombie story. In fact, in a class recently where we were talking about joy and how to practice joy, like a mindfulness practice or exercise in a time when it's very hard to feel joyful because things are so scary, which is precisely when we need it. And we looked at two film clips. One was from Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It was made into a movie that was just as bleak as the book. It's all brown and black and white and gray and lifeless and utterly hopeless. The feeling is totally despair. And of course, we have the burned out cars and we have people eating one another. And then we were sort of like, yeah. We've heard that so many times. People's stories just start to go down that neatly well-greased neural pathway because the brain's like, yep, this is what happened. This is how it goes. This is where we're headed. Then we looked at a clip from, do you remember Life is Beautiful, the Italian film from, I think it was in the mid-90s. It's a beautiful film, won all kinds of awards, in which an Italian man is in a city that's been turned into a camp during Nazi occupation. And he's hiding his little boy from the Nazis and from all the horrors around them. And even though he's been put in a work uniform and he's working, he's like pushing a wheelbarrow with this little kid in it under burlap. And he's making a game out of it. So the boy misses the worst of it and thinks they're playing a game. It's almost like a big city hide and seek kind of thing. And there's so many joyful moments juxtaposed with this just absolute horror, but we have hope the whole way through. And there's this incredible scene where a bunch of workers are being pushed through the street and their heads are down. They're all hopeless. They're all like, this is not going to end well. This is the end of our lives. But the man is like looking around for what's still possible. And he sees an open door. And that's where the Nazi officers have been barking orders over this broadcasting system throughout the city. He sneaks in there and he brings the boy in and he gets on and he starts telling a fairy tale in Italian. And his wife is in a section of the work camp with the other mothers. And she hears her husband's voice and she hears the story, which is their love story that he's made into a fairy tale. And all of the women know what's happening. And you see the joy that he brings to all these people in this moment of possibility by taking this moment. And then the boy gets on and gets to say something to his mother and they get out of there before they even get caught. And of course, in the end, the man dies, but the boy comes out of it relatively unscathed because the father got him all the way to the end of occupation with relatively little damage. So my point being, what if this ends well? What is possible? What doorway haven't you looked into when you're telling your story, when you're listening to someone else's story, when you're reading social media and reading the news? It all sounds so terrible, but there's this groundswell of community building. There's this groundswell of generosity and kindness that's happening and incredible joyful resistance. And we have to find that in our stories too. So that's what I'm interested in now. And I think that we're seeing that in the kinds of books that people are gravitating towards, say, like Ross Gay's collections of essays, Inciting Joy or the Book of Delights, right? They're real sustenance for sure.
Yes to joy. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think I remember you posting something on social media a while back that was joy is the resistance. Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Can we go into that just a little bit?
Well, it's sort of like what this Italian man in the film Life is Beautiful did by daring to go in there, by just even looking up and looking through the door and imagining what might be possible when everybody else's heads are down. That was a tremendous moment of resistance because he dared his life to bring joy to his wife and all the other mothers and his son, and to keep himself going for another day. I mean, it helps us be sustainable too. And there have been whole groups of people that have been horribly oppressed that have found joy and humor as great forms of resistance and nourishment and sustainability. And I'm thinking of Native American humor, for example. When you see a great work of art like Reservation Dogs, the television series that was Native directed, Native written, Native character. I mean, it was all Native. I think there was one white person on the whole script writing team. And it's a heartbreaking story. And these kids have suffered this tremendous loss, this group of friends. Yet there's so many moments of humor and delight and grace and outright defiance of systems that squeeze the life out of us all. Even if we benefit from them, they're squeezing the life out of us. So I do think about somebody like Nelson Mandela, who was imprisoned for decades and tortured and demeaned, yet he continued to befriend his guards and ask about their children and ask about who'd won the football/soccer match. And then when he was sworn in as president, some of those guards were on the front row. So the kindness and the humor and the joy, they keep us going, but they also change other people. Anything else, it just destroys our own souls. We're not sustainable in that form. I'm still troubled by much of what's being published out there that focuses very much on this privileged world we live in without naming the costs of it or contextualizing it as something that's also connected to other systems in which people suffer. And I'm troubled by how many of those books continue to win awards and how many books continue to get ignored. So, for example, the New York Times last year or the year before came up with their list of the 100 best books of the new century. There wasn't a single Native writer on it.
Wow.
There was maybe one book that addressed climate change, and there was one or two books that were by Western writers. So all these things that matter just weren't being recognized. And so I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of reminding the people who decide for us, who list what books matter, because that's not what's saving people.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that's a great point. We need to hear from everyone. We need to hear everyone's voice right now. And it's more important than ever to hear everyone's voice. So thank you for bringing that up. As we end this, I would love to know if you have any advice for our listeners of how they can cultivate joy in their lives.
Yes. In fact, I've been studying this a great deal to be able to teach a whole course on it recently. And because I think it's core to what we actually write, we have to find delight in what we're writing. And most people I know do not. But joy is something that erupts spontaneously. It comes from being absolutely present in the moment, paying attention, which is something we almost cannot do now, given the screens, given the scrolling, given the crises and the work schedules we're supposed to keep. And I have heard from several sources that we now officially have the same level, or we've just dropped below the level of attention that a goldfish has. And I see it in a lot of courses. I see it on the street, at the bank. People are just trying to get through their day, but they're so overwhelmed with sensory stimulus and this scrolling thing that makes our mind jump around. You cannot have joy if you can't sustain attention. It's possible to reclaim it. A mindfulness practice, it can be secular, it can be Buddhist, whatever. A mindfulness practice is really good for retraining our brains to pay attention and spending less time on screens and actually getting back to reading, even if it's just a poem, one poem a day. You know, the news will still be bad when you get there and all the clickbait titles will still be there. And maybe you check in once a week or twice a week, or you scan the headlines, but you still find time to read other things that remind why it matters to pay attention and why we want to linger on words and why we want the beautiful things like a Ross Gay essay to sink deeply into our bones and spread through our nervous system. Because then we feel what's possible. Then we're available for joy to happen to us. It's not something that we can make happen. I think we're so used to passively receiving pleasure and entertainment that we don't understand that we're not spoon-fed joy. It's something that we show up for.
I can't agree more. I feel like every time that I ignore my screen and I get outside for a walk, I find joy just in the little things. I'll notice that there's still a few apples on the apple tree that was full of apples a couple months ago. And I'll think, oh, they're still hanging on. I'll see flowers blooming in my garden, even though it's been so cold and everything else has gone fallow and all the leaves are gone. It's just so beautiful to recognize what's around us and to look up at the moon and to value what we have here in front of us. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah. And maybe I could make one more plug for paying attention and the world of books and stories. Somebody who's been gaining traction and attention and publishing books that really need to be read is Torrey House Press, Stories and Voices for the West. For example, Craig Child's most recent book, The Wild Dark, it's one of my favorite books that Craig's ever written. And it was Torrey House that published it. And it has one of the most beautiful covers. I think it's Jeremy Collins who did the artwork. Is one example of Torrey House's fine books. And it's all about what we're losing by losing the night sky. It's also a celebration. It's joyful. It's beautiful what the dark does for us. And another title would be Pam Houston's Without Exception, which is about her own experiences with abortion and reproductive rights and her response to the rights that have been lost of late. So Tory House, like all the great nonprofits, have taken a huge hit because of all the funding that's been slashed. There will be an online fundraiser Sunday, December 28th. You can go to the Tory House Press site and register. You can get on their newsletter. You can see all their great titles. So that night will be some discussion, reading, really talking about why stories matter right now. And that will be myself, Craig Childs, Pam Houston, and the women who wrote the foreword and the afterword for my book, Desert Cabal, Regina Lopez White Skunk, who's a Mountain Ute tribal representative who's been very much involved in, among other great environmental movements, the establishment of the Bears Ears National Monument. And dear Blake Spalding, who is the co-owner with Jen Castle of Hell's Backbone Grill. And now they also own the Boulder Mountain Lodge in Boulder, Utah. And for those who haven't been there, I highly recommend you go. There's no better place to eat and sleep and walk. So it will be all of us talking about storytelling, and I sure hope you'll join us.
That sounds amazing.
Pretty fun group of people.
Yeah. All right, let's go. And again, that date was December
28th.
Okay.
If you go to the Tory House Press website, it will be posted. You can also register for their newsletter and you'll receive information about that.
Perfect.
They'll be posting on social media about it.
Woohoo.
Yeah.
All right. I think I've got plans.
It's a date.
Yay. Thank you so much for sharing today, Amy. Thank you for everything. It was a pleasure to be inspired by you to pay attention and to realize that joy could just be right around the corner. So thank you for that.
Yeah. My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Yvonne. It's really nice to see you.
You too.